Person, woman, man, camera, TV. With those 5 words, a president reassured a nation of his mental and cognitive fitness for office. Or did he? Because there are some who are still concerned, have indeed been raising concerns about his fitness for some time. Joining us now is one such guest. Dr. Bandy Lee, Yale forensic psychiatrist, joins us on the Damage Report.
Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you on. I have to say that in real time, as I was watching that interview that Donald Trump engaged in, I was thinking about you at the time and wondering what your response was. And I know that there's a couple different angles on this that we're going to get into, but what did you make of that episode and the media reaction to it?
I was first struck by how he kept bringing up his cognitive exam. And as he revealed the details, it turned out to be an exam that he took 2.5 years ago, with Dr. Ronnie Jackson, a White House doctor, White House employed subordinate to the commander-in-chief physician, and therefore not eligible, in fact, to do a fitness for duty exam. And yet he did this cognitive screen that usually takes about 10 minutes and declared the president mentally fit. It's not a fitness exam, has nothing to do with fitness. It's even questionable as a screen because since its inception, people, full-blown Alzheimer's patients and hospitalized schizophrenia patients were found to ace the test, and therefore there have been even new guidelines as to what the test means and does not mean because of many misinterpretations. And now Dr. Ronnie Jackson has not been in his position for, I believe, 2 years at this point, and yet the president was bringing up this test apparently to prove that he was mentally fit or cognitively intact. And so it was more revealing, the fact that he kept bringing up this test.
Yeah, and even during that interview, he kept bringing up specific points about it, not only repeating the list of words multiple times, but repeating that you get bonus points if you get them in order. He kept coming back to that as if he was forgetting that he had said it. So you've talked about misinterpretations about what that test is actually for and what it shows. It seems like he is an individual who is laboring under a misconception about it. And I have to wonder if it was inaccurately presented to him when he did it, or if he is simply advancing an inaccurate portrayal. I would assume, we can't know for sure, but when doctors present this sort of test, they are likely to be pretty clear about what it actually says. Is that a fair assumption?
I found it questionable when the White House doctor presented it in the first place as a fitness test, because that was the basis on which he declared the president mentally fit. And so it seemed to me that it was used in a way to give the president reassurance, and maybe even the public reassurance, rather than to actually do the necessary tests, which at that time we were recommending a full neuropsychiatric evaluation, not just a 10-minute screen, which is generally for people who show no symptoms or for whom the screen is not that important because it's a very insensitive test. Now, because of this initial presentation, the president seemed to be trying to revive that use of the test as a fitness test in order to, I believe, convince himself, even more so than others, that he was mentally fit. It would be consistent with the pattern of impairment that he has shown. We by now, even though we have not examined him, we have detected enough patterns to recognize what types of defenses the president has and what are his tendencies. And we have for a long time warned that not only his lack of mental capacity, which we were able to fully evaluate, in fact, but his attempts to cover up his mental incapacity would make him a rather dangerous president.
Well, and I know that the last time that you were on the show, you predicted at the time that we would see some amount of decline in the last few years of his presidency. Do you believe that we are in fact witnessing that? I know it's been a bit since you were on the show.
Yes, absolutely. We had no other estimation than that he would worsen over time, and that the powers of the presidency would worsen his symptoms. In other words, aggravate his grandiosity, his delusions of grandeur and impunity, which have in fact worsened even since the impeachment, the very delayed impeachment with very few articles then being acquitted from it. We were in fact estimating that he would have largely unrealistic expectations as a result of this, including that he could somehow thwart the election and stay in the presidency, even if he were to lose an election. And these were our concerns, and they're shaping up to be true in front of us. And that he would go to any extent to realize this wishful thinking, including inciting violence, waging war, or stumbling into a war. We were very concerned about great dangers to the nation because of his psychological disposition.
And I think that you might be sort of hinting at this, but I know that you've talked recently about your conception of fascism as less of an ideologically distinct worldview and more of a psychologically distinct worldview, that these sorts of psychological predispositions and characteristics can give rise to what expresses itself in terms of politics as authoritarian or fascist sort of policies. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yes, I was actually echoing Madeleine Albright's statement that fascism is not so much a political ideology, and this is something that I have often said, because fascism in a sense is the end stage of psychological dangerousness. In other words, if a psychologically dangerous individual is given political power, then that danger spreads into social, cultural, civic, and geopolitical dangerousness. And that is fascism. And I think it's important to make a distinction between what is a healthy variation. There are many ideologies, considerable human variation that is within the healthy realm, and then the pathological state, which is actually quite identifiable because it becomes more rigid and stereotypical, and we see it occur in many countries. It's unprecedented for the United States, perhaps, but we have seen it in other countries, and we have seen how it brings about complete devastation, and often destruction of the nation. And therefore that's the characteristic of pathology, that unlike healthy ideologies, which are life-affirming, pathology always brings about destruction. And that is why it's important to identify those characteristics.
Interesting. And I apologize in advance if I have a little bit of trouble expressing the thought that I have right now, but it was triggered when you mentioned one of his characteristics was the delusions of grandeur, the delusions of impunity, and things like that. And I kind of just want your thoughts. Like, it seems to me as if when trying to analyze his behavior and his decision-making process, that he has, as you say, these delusions of impunity, but also in hindsight, he appears to have a great deal of impunity. Like, he believed that he would get away with the crimes, and he has gotten away with the crimes. The impeachment doesn't really seem to have affected him. He believes that sort of lashing out with violence against his own people will make him more popular. It doesn't seem to be destroying his popularity. Like, at what point does it move from one of these pathologies to a rational calculation about how dark our political system and many of the worldviews of our own citizens are?
Well, certainly the brokenness of the political system and weak structures in society allow pathology to spread. But when a person with severe symptoms is placed in an influential position, we also need to think about contagion of mental symptoms. Now, not many people often think about this, including psychiatrists who are often overly fixated on individual care, but those of us who are in preventive psychiatry and public health, such as I have been throughout my career, recognize very readily that mental symptoms can spread through positions of influence. In fact, it's even more contagious than the ordinary infectious diseases like the coronavirus, because you do not need physical exposure for the spread of symptoms. You only need emotional bonds. Mm-hmm. And therefore the spread is perhaps even more, it happens more readily and is more ominous. And what you are seeing in terms of the fervent, irrational support that he is able to elicit, that is actually what we expect from severe symptomatology, especially delusions and delusions of paranoia. It's well documented in political psychology, but also in ordinary situations of mental health. I've seen it a great deal in prison settings, state hospital settings. And so that's something we need to take into consideration, that it is not a healthy endorsement. It's not informed consent. It is spread of pathology that is also destructive for those who are willingly signing on as well.
You know, I have one more question, because I know you've talked about before, and I believe maybe even on this show, about the need for us to take these sorts of considerations more seriously when choosing our politicians. And you've talked even about some sort of screening for politicians as well. Do you have any worries about the possible, like the interaction of that with partisanship, or it being politicized or something like that? How could we do that in a way that informs people about the personality and psychological characteristics of their politicians that they need to know, but that couldn't be used to try to weed out people that simply think differently, that sort of thing?
Yes. That's where expertise comes in very handy. Consult with experts. If we are professional and if we are honest, if we check ourselves in terms of biases, we come to a consensus. That is how we are trained. Politics plays no role in medical assessments, and we are supposed to apply medical neutrality, which is to say that we state things as they are, regardless of political inconvenience or political pressures. And there is a difference between using one's professional title to get done a professional goal versus bringing professionalism regardless of the setting, including the political, because the political sphere is not free of mental health problems. It is, president is not immune from mental incapacity. And I think it's probably important to state right now exactly what is going on, in that we have an executive of the country who would be aptly labeled killer in chief. He is not a protector of the nation. He is currently incurring the vast number of the deaths that have already occurred. Epidemiologists measure between 70 and 99%, and with no end in sight. Yeah. And I think this is important to recognize, because that is the reality, and not stay with safe or comfortable assumptions that a commander-in-chief would not be doing this. In fact, even Mr. Trump himself is human before he is president. And this is the incapacity that he is bringing to his vast level of power, from which he has full access to at this point. Yeah. And it is a very, very grave situation that will become increasingly, acceleratingly more serious over the next few months.
I certainly share that fear. Dr. Bandy Lee, as always, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/thedamagereport. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.